Everyone who has ever lost someone they love has been lied to about how to grieve. And the person who told you the truth 2,000 years ago was a man who had just watched his best friend die. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, Roman philosopher, playwright, the man who tutored the most powerful emperor on earth. And when his close friend, a man named Aeneas Serenus, died suddenly, Seneca did not write about controlling his emotions. He did not write about logic or reason or moving on. He wrote something that looks, on the surface, like it breaks every Stoic rule ever written. He wrote, "I wept so excessively that, in spite of my wishes, I must be included among the examples of men who have been overcome by grief." That is Seneca, the Stoic, one of the most celebrated minds in the ancient world, admitting, in writing to a friend with no apology, that he was destroyed by grief. And what comes after that confession, the letter he wrote about it, the consolation letters he sent to others, is, in my opinion, one of the most honest bodies of writing about loss that any human being has ever produced. And almost nobody talks about it. Here's the problem with how we've been taught to handle loss. Someone dies. Someone leaves. Someone is just gone. And the world hands you a script. You've heard it so many times you probably say it yourself now without thinking. Time heals everything. They would have wanted you to move on. Stay strong. Everything happens for a reason. These phrases, and I want to say this carefully, are not comfort. They are dismissals dressed in comfort's clothing. They are things people say when they don't know what to say, and they need you to stop grieving because your grief is making them uncomfortable. But here's the thing I really want you to sit with, because this is the part that nobody says out loud. Not in therapy, not in self-help books, not in the 5 stages model. We are not just grieving the person. We are grieving the version of ourselves that existed when they were alive. The self that had someone to call at 2 a.m. when everything fell apart. The self that had someone who knew your whole history, every embarrassing thing, every failure, every private joke, and loved you anyway. The self that was witnessed, that was known, that had a specific shape in someone else's eyes. When that person dies or leaves or disappears from your life, that version of you becomes unmoored. It loses its anchor. And you're not just mourning them. You're mourning the you that only existed in relation to them. And no grief checklist on earth addresses that. No be strong culture, no 5 stages, no inspirational quote accounts. Nobody is talking about the loneliness inside the grief. The part that is not really about the dead. The part that is about the living. About you, alone, with a shape that no longer has anything to rest against. That is what makes grief unbearable in a way that's very hard to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. It's not just that they're gone. It's that part of you goes with them. And that part doesn't come back. 2,000 years ago, Seneca looked directly at that. He named it. He sat with it. And then he said something that will probably surprise you. Let me give you some context for just how radical Seneca's position actually was. Because to understand why it matters, you have to understand what he was pushing against. Traditional Stoicism, the version handed down through Epictetus, the version most people encounter first, said something like this: grief is an error of judgment. It is a false belief that something outside your control, namely whether another person lives or dies, has the power to determine your inner peace. Feel the grief briefly if you must. Acknowledge it. Then reason your way out of it, because the Stoic ideal was a kind of inner fortress that nothing external could breach for long. That's the philosophy. Clean, logical, and, in a moment of real loss, almost completely useless. Which is why, when millions of people turn to Stoicism during the worst seasons of their lives, and they do in enormous numbers, they often come away feeling worse than when they started. Not because the philosophy is wrong, but because they were handed a version of it that has been stripped of its most human part. They were handed the armor without the man inside it. And here is where Seneca breaks from his own tradition in a way that I think is either never noticed or quietly glossed over. Seneca understood something that the cleaner, colder versions of Stoic philosophy did not want to admit. If you could grieve someone and feel nothing, if the loss of a person could pass through you like weather, it would mean they meant nothing. The depth of the wound is the measure of the love. Remove the grief and you don't transcend the loss. You unmake the relationship. You erase it retroactively. He wrote this directly. In letter 63, talking about the death of a friend, he makes an argument that the Stoic tradition had largely avoided. The grief is the proof of the love. To feel no grief would mean there was no friendship worth grieving. And a life lived without that depth of connection is a greater loss than any death. So the question Seneca was actually asking, across 3 separate consolation letters, to 3 separate people, was not the one we usually attribute to philosophy. Not, how do I stop feeling this? But something much harder and much more honest. How do I honor this grief without being swallowed by it?
There were 3 people Seneca wrote consolation letters for. 3 separate letters. 3 completely different people, 3 completely different losses, 3 approaches to the same unbearable problem. And what he says to the third person, a woman named Marcia, is, I think, the piece of writing that people who are grieving right now today most need to hear. I'm going to walk you through all 3, starting now.
Letter 63. This is the one most referenced in Stoic circles, and most people still get it wrong. Seneca's close friend Lucilius has just lost his friend Flaccus. The wound is fresh. And Seneca's response opens with a line that sounds, on first reading, like a contradiction. I would not have you sorrow more than is fitting. Notice what he does not say. He does not say, do not sorrow. He does not say, feel nothing. He does not say, move on. More than is fitting. There is a fitting amount of grief. Seneca is not drawing a line at the beginning of sorrow. He is drawing it at the far end. At the place where grief stops being about the person you lost, their life, what they gave you, who you were together, and starts being about you. About maintaining the wound as proof of your love. About performing loss so that the world knows you loved them. About building a life organized around a sorrow that has, by now, become its own reason for existing. And here is the confession I mentioned at the beginning. Seneca doesn't just give advice. He tells Lucilius, I failed at this myself. He admits that when his friend Aeneas Serenus died, he wept so excessively that, and this is his phrase, he must be counted among the examples of men who were overcome by grief. A Stoic master. Not above it. Not beyond it. Overcome by it. He says this not as a confession of weakness to be ashamed of, but as a diagnosis of what went wrong, and why. He says, the reason I grieved so completely was that I had invested too much of myself in one friendship. I had not spread my love widely enough. I was not, he says, prepared. His advice to Lucilius is intimate and specific. He does not say, reason your way through it. He says, you have buried one whom you loved. Look about for someone to love. Not to replace the dead. That's not what he means, and it's a misreading that cheapens the instruction. He means, resist the impulse to close yourself to all future love because this particular love cost you so much. Closing yourself is not loyalty to the dead. It is punishment of the living, of you. That is the first letter. It speaks to fresh, acute grief. It says, feel it but don't make it your architecture. The second letter, letter 99, is harder to read. I want to warn you about that. A man named Marilus has just lost his young son. The child was small. The letter refers to him as a child of unknown promise, a life barely begun. And Seneca writes him something that, by modern standards, sounds almost brutal. He says, I am not going to be gentle with you. Not because I don't care about your suffering, but because I think you are intelligent enough to handle the truth. And the truth, right now, is more useful to you than comfort. His argument is essentially this. You are suffering in part because you are surprised. You feel that this was not supposed to happen. That the death of your child is an aberration, a violation of the natural order, a wound inflicted on you by fate. And Seneca says, that belief is the real source of your suffering. Not the loss itself. The loss was always coming. The suffering is in the collision between what happened and what you believe should have happened. He writes, and I'm paraphrasing the translation here, a fragment of time has been lost. Not a life interrupted. A fragment of time, because from any perspective larger than our own immediate feeling, even a long human life is brief. Now, I want to be clear about what Seneca is and is not saying here. Because this letter is often quoted to make Stoicism sound cold, and I think that reading misses the point entirely. He is not saying the love didn't matter. He is not saying the child didn't matter. He is saying something more difficult and more true. The love and the loss were always a single thing. You cannot love someone who is mortal, which is every person you will ever love, without accepting, somewhere underneath the love, that they will die. Or that you will. That this is not a betrayal by the universe. It is the terms of the agreement you made the moment you chose to love. That reframing, from, this shouldn't be happening to me, to, this was always part of what love is not relief. It is not comfort in any warm sense of the word. It is something harder and more valuable. It is clarity. And Seneca believed that clarity, even painful clarity, is the only honest foundation for healing. Everything built on the idea that this shouldn't have happened will crack eventually. Everything built on the truth of what is can hold. That is the second letter. Harsher. More confrontational. And aimed, I think, at the specific grief that comes with injustice. The loss that feels wrong in a way that goes beyond the personal.
But the letter I want to spend the most time on, the one that has stayed with me longer than anything else Seneca wrote, and the one I almost never see referenced anywhere, is the letter he wrote to a woman named Marcia. Because what Seneca says to Marcia is something almost no one will say to someone who is grieving. It is not comforting. It is not harsh. It is something rarer than either of those things. It is honest about what grief can become, and what it costs you if you let it.
Marcia was the daughter of a famous historian named Cremutius Cordus, a man whose books were burned by the Emperor Tiberius, who was eventually forced to take his own life for the crime of writing truthfully about Roman history. Marcia had already carried that loss. And then her son Metilius died. Seneca writes to her 3 years after that death. 3 years, and she is still, by every account, grieving as if it happened that morning. The loss has not softened. If anything, it has deepened and settled. Her entire life has been reorganized around the wound. He opens by listing everything that has already been tried and failed. The consolation of friends, the influence of people she respected, the literature she had grown up loving. All of it useless. The grief has made itself at home in her. And Seneca says explicitly, the normal remedies have failed. So I am not going to offer you more of them. I have decided, he writes, to do battle with your grief. And then he names something that I have been thinking about for years. He says, 3 years have already passed, and still your grief has lost none of its first poignancy, but renews and strengthens itself day by day. He is not saying this to criticize her love for her son. He is not saying she grieved wrong. He is saying something more specific and more uncomfortable. This grief has become something separate now from the love that produced it. It has taken on its own life, its own structure, its own daily purpose. And the grief, at this point, 3 years in, is no longer entirely about Metilius. It is about Marcia. Here is what I think Seneca is seeing, and what I think is the most important thing in this entire letter, maybe in all his writing on grief. There are 2 things you can do with a loss. You can keep it as a wound. You can maintain it, return to it every morning, organize your days around it, make it the central fact of your identity. Grief as a wound asks nothing of you except that you keep it open, that you not forget, that you stay. And there is something in us, something deep and loyal, that wants to do exactly that. Because the wound is, in a strange way, a form of closeness. As long as you are suffering for them, you are still connected to them. Moving forward feels like abandonment. Or, and this is the harder thing, you can let the grief become an inheritance. You can take everything they gave you, the way they saw the world, the things they taught you, the parts of yourself that only existed because they existed, and you can carry those things forward. Into your actual life. Into the world. Into the people you still love and the work you still have left to do. And that second option is terrifying. Because it asks something enormous of you. It asks you to act on what they gave you with no further input from them. With no confirmation that you're doing it right. With no one watching who knew them the way you knew them. You have to take the inheritance and do something with it alone. The wound is, in some ways, easier. The wound at least keeps them present. The wound requires nothing except endurance. And endurance is something grief can do forever. Seneca sees all of this in Marcia. And he loves her enough, respects her enough, to say it plainly. Your grief has become its own thing. It has separated from Metilius and attached to you. And the cost of maintaining it is your life. He ends the consolation to Marcia with one of the most remarkable passages in all of ancient literature. He imagines her son Metilius, somewhere beyond death, free from the suffering of mortal life, looking down at his mother and saying to her, "Why do you waste yourself with this endless weeping? Why do you wear out your days in mourning? What has been done to you? What wrong? Your grief does not reach me. I'm not there. Cease to torment yourself. Not, forget me. Not, I didn't matter. But, I mattered enough for you to keep living. Use what I gave you. Give it somewhere to go."
So let me put all of this together. Because Seneca, across these 3 letters, is actually giving us a framework. Not a philosophical abstraction. Not a lecture on Stoic doctrine. A real, practical, human framework for what to do with grief. 3 things. Let me walk you through them.
Number 1, let the grief be real. Do not suppress the tears. Do not perform strength for people who are made uncomfortable by your pain. Seneca himself wept. He admitted it. He did not dress it up or explain it away. The grief is not your weakness. It is not evidence that you are broken or that you haven't read enough philosophy. It is the measure of what you loved. The depth of the wound tells you something true about the depth of the love, and that is worth honoring. Give yourself the tears. Give yourself the time. The first letter says, "More than is fitting is the line." But fitting grief, genuine, full, unperformed grief, is not only acceptable. It is necessary. Number 2, watch for the moment the grief changes. This is the hardest one, and I want to be careful about how I say it because I am not giving you a timeline. There is no day on which grief should stop. There is no month at which it becomes wrong. But Seneca is asking you to be honest with yourself about what the grief is doing. There is a difference between grief that is still about the person, that comes in waves when you remember them, that sits with you on their birthday, that visits you in ordinary moments and takes your breath away, and grief that has become the organizing principle of your entire existence. The thing that defines you. The reason you cannot begin anything new, love anything new, want anything new. You will know the difference. Not when someone tells you. When you are honest with yourself at 3 a.m. and you ask, is this still about them? Or is this about me now? Is this love still? Or is this the way I've learned to avoid living? That is the question Seneca puts to Marcia. And he puts it gently enough to be heard. Number 3, convert the loss. This is Seneca's deepest instruction, and the one that requires the most of you. Everything they gave you, the way they saw you, the things they believed you were capable of, the parts of yourself that grew in the warmth of being known by them, that does not die when they die. You carry it, and you are now responsible for it. Not as a burden, as an inheritance. The question is not, how do I stop grieving? The question is, what do I do with what they gave me? How do I take the love they offered me and put it into the world, into the people still around me, into the work still in front of me, into the life I still have left? That is the conversion. From wound to inheritance. From loss to direction. Pause, settle into this. Seneca's Stoicism is not the cold, detached philosophy that the internet has made it. It is not about suppression or logic or performing strength. It is, at its core, a philosophy of what it means to love something mortal, which is every single thing you will ever love, and to keep going anyway. It does not ask you to pretend the wound isn't there. It asks you, gently at first and then with more firmness, to become more than the wound, to be larger than what happened to you, to take the grief and, eventually, give it somewhere worth going. If you are grieving right now, today, this week, this year, or some year that happened a long time ago and still visits you, I want to say something that I don't think enough people will say to you. The fact that you are still feeling it does not mean you are broken. It means the love was real. And real love, in a mortal world, always costs something. That is not a design flaw. That is the whole point. Seneca, 2,000 years ago, in a Rome that had none of our words for what grief does to the nervous system, none of our frameworks, none of our language for mental health, sat down with a piece of wax and a stylus and wrote the truest thing he knew. Grief is love with nowhere to go. Give it somewhere to go. I've been making videos about the Stoics for a while now. And in all of that, all the reading, all the letters, all the philosophy, this is the part that stays with me. Not the discipline. Not the resilience frameworks. Not the productivity advice dressed up in Roman clothes. The part where a 2,000-year-old man admits he wept too much. And then tells you, not coldly, not cleverly, but honestly, what to do with the weight you are carrying. If that meant something to you today, share it with someone who needs it. Leave a comment. Tell me what you're carrying. I read them. And if you want to go deeper into Seneca, there is a lot more where this came from.